Carmel Sivaloni.
Mr Speaker, the bill deals with several issues. A particular focus of the bill has been to ensure that children are adequately protected from assault, neglect and ill treatment. This bill does implement the Law Commission's recommendations in this area, and this bill also addresses an emerging knife crime problem and responds to issues of scope with the sexual grooming offence and the claim of right defence. And Mr Speaker, we of course support this bill and support the measures that this bill takes to prevent and mitigate the harm of abuse against children. However, and there often is a however when we say that we support a government bill, we do have reservations with certain provisions and their ability to be effective in combating the actual problem, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, when we listened to the previous National Party MP, we heard him talk about the concern that the government has for children that are abused or children that are at risk of being abused. And on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we share those concerns. We are, of course, concerned about abused children and about the risk of abuse to children. However, on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we do want to take an approach where possible, where it is the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance constantly at the bottom. And what we're seeing with that side of the House is that the focus is overwhelmingly on the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, Mr Speaker. And we support that because we support aspects of that, given that there are times when that is necessary. But when that's the entire focus, then we are concerned, because what we're going to see, Mr Speaker, is the need for more and more ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. And that's what that government is setting us up to have to respond to. When they talk about the abuse of children, I can't help but reflect on some of the decisions that have been made by the government recently, Mr Speaker. Some decisions that actually don't protect the best interests of children, that don't protect the best interest of those children's mothers. Decisions like the cuts to domestic violence programs that have been made by that side of the House, Mr Speaker. Cuts to the Te Rito programs, cuts to the Women's Refuge, cuts to counselling services for victims of sexual abuse through ACC, and those are all the kinds of things that this side of the House would expect any government that cares and purports to care for children who are abused or at risk of being abused, Mr Speaker. So again, as I said before, we on this side of the House do support this bill, as we do have concerns, but we are disappointed with the government that they only seem to put measures into place, to take legislation seriously when they are already acting as the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And along the lines of things that have been cut, Mr Speaker, I should also mention the inability of the national government to deal with legislation that would actually make a difference with respect to violence, with respect to women and violence, with respect to children who are abused or could be abused. And the bill that I'm thinking of is that domestic violence bill that was thoroughly consulted upon with organisations in the sector, that continues to languish at the bottom of the order paper, Mr Speaker. It continues to languish at the bottom of the order paper, and the Minister of Justice says that parts of it have been done, but it's been done in a piecemeal kind of way, Mr Speaker, and that is the concern. It's been done in a piecemeal kind of way, rather than taking the entire piece of legislation that was consulted on widely, that was agreed on widely within the sector, and implementing it in its entirety. It has been implemented by that Minister of Justice and the national government in a piecemeal kind of way. And that's concerning to us on this side of the House, because we would expect any responsible government to take something like domestic violence seriously, particularly when they stand up in the House and purport to be advocates for children that are abused or at risk of being abused. Mr Speaker, one of the things that is concerning about this bill is the select committee that the government have decided to put it through. It is There is a distinct legal nature to the bill, Mr Speaker, and yet we see it go through the Social Services Select Committee. And one has to wonder whether that is the appropriate Select Committee to consider this piece of legislation. It's not the first time we've seen it with that government, Mr Speaker. We've seen it before. We saw it with the 3 strikes legislation, which should have gone through the Justice Committee, but instead, and we did have to wonder whether this was because the Minister of Justice just didn't agree with the 3 strikes legislation. Instead, we saw that piece of legislation go through the Law and Order Select Committee, and it really wasn't appropriate that we had the Department of Corrections, or was it the police? The Department of Corrections overseeing a sentencing bill. And yet we do, again, as I said before, have to wonder whether that was purely because the Minister of Justice actually didn't agree with that 3 strikes legislation and wanted to wash his hands of it and hand it over to somebody else because it was all part of the pact that they had with the ACT Party. So it had to happen, but the Minister of Justice did have some sense and did not want to have that happen under his watch in terms of his select committee, his portfolio area, his ministry, Mr Speaker. So as I said, going back to what I said at the beginning, we are concerned about the level of abuse of our children in this country and the risk of abuse to our children in this country. I think that some of the measures that were implemented by the former government, the Labor government, are a testament to the fact that we do take the abuse of our children seriously. At that point in time, we did have cross-party support, and that again is testament to the fact that we do share across this House a genuine concern for our children, and we do not want to let politics get in the way of that to that extent. Yet, as I said, it is important that we do lay out all of the reservations that we had on this bill. We have on this bill. We can't pretend that we accept it in its entirety. We can't pretend that within the context of what the government's done over the past 2.5 years that we think that by them purporting to be acting in the interest of children, that has always happened. So we have to put it into context in terms of some of the other decisions that have been made by the national government over the last 2.5 years, and quite frankly, some of those decisions are disappointing and they weren't made in the best interest of children. There is a possibility with this legislation, with what it proposes, that false reporting may lead to an overloading of social service agencies, according to several welfare groups and academics. And that's a concern to us because we're already getting reports from those agencies that they are becoming increasingly overwhelmed by the workload that they're facing. Increasingly overwhelmed because of the needs that the people that are coming to them have, the challenges that they're facing, increasingly overwhelmed because of the poverty that they're seeing, the stresses that they're seeing families under. And it really, putting it into context, is about the climate that we have at the moment, the continued increase in cost of living, the severe underemployment in this country, if not underemployment then unemployment, and just the fact that families are really struggling at the moment. And when families struggle, Mr Speaker, then what we see are that our social service agencies also struggle. And so they are concerned that this legislation and the provisions of it will lead that may lead to false reporting, and that may lead to an overloading of social service agencies. Mr Speaker, the Children's Commissioner John Angus said mandatory reporting of child abuse would swamp child, youth and family. New Zealand already has a high level of reporting on abuse incidences and needed to respond better to those cases rather than bring in mandatory reporting. So there are a number of concerns that I've laid out tonight, Mr Speaker, with regards to this legislation. As I said earlier, we will be supporting it. We are watching that space. We are concerned, though, that it isn't going through the right select committee and concerned about what that might mean when it's being considered. We do have concerns about the other pieces of legislation that the government has made, the decisions that they have made that are not supportive of women and children, and that actually don't protect both women and children from the harm that they may encounter with regards to violence and abuse, Mr Speaker. So we support the bill, but as I said, we have some major reservations about what the government is doing. Thank you.
Honourable Simon